Think about the house you live in, the windows it has, the insulation in its walls or the lack of it, the radiators it relies on through winter, the absence of any mechanical cooling for summer, the drainage system that runs beneath the street outside, the school your children attend, its classrooms designed without any consideration of sustained summer heat, the hospital in your city, built in an era when a summer temperature above 30 degrees in England was a rare and celebrated anomaly rather than an annual expectation. Now consider this. Every single one of those buildings, your home, your children's school, your local hospital, the roads you drive, the railway lines you travel, the water pipes beneath the streets, was designed and constructed for a climate that, according to the government's own independent climate advisors, no longer exists. Not a climate that is changing, a climate that is already changed enough that the entire built environment of the United Kingdom is now operating outside the conditions it was designed for. And today, May 20th, 2026, those advisors published the most comprehensive and direct assessment of what that means, and what Britain must do about it, that has ever been placed before a British government. The report is called A Well-Adapted UK. What it actually describes is how thoroughly unprepared Britain is for the country it has already become. The Climate Change Committee published A Well-Adapted UK this morning, and the language inside it is not the language of distant projections and hedged forecasts. It is the language of a body that has been watching successive governments fail to act on their warnings and has finally decided that the only responsible course is absolute clarity. The committee's chair, Baroness Brown, put the central finding in a single sentence that deserves to be read slowly. The UK was built for a climate that no longer exists today and will be increasingly distant in years to come. That sentence is not a prediction about the future. It is a statement about the present. The climate that Britain's Victorian sewers were designed for is gone. The climate that determined the thickness of insulation in mid-20th century housing is gone. The climate that made air conditioning a luxury rather than a medical necessity in hospitals and care homes is gone. The infrastructure the country depends on for every dimension of daily life was calibrated for a set of temperature extremes, rainfall intensities, flood frequencies, and drought durations that no longer describe what Britain actually experiences. And the gap between what the infrastructure was designed for and what the climate is now delivering is not stable. It is widening every year, and without action, it will widen dramatically further. The three headline risks that the Climate Change Committee identifies in the report are heat, flooding, and drought. They are not presented as separate problems. They are presented as three simultaneous and compounding threats that a country with a 19th and 20th century built environment is profoundly ill-equipped to handle at the frequency and intensity that mid-21st century climate conditions will deliver. Understanding each one fully, what the numbers mean, what they look like in practice, and why the existing infrastructure fails so comprehensively to address them, is essential context for understanding why the report's call for urgent and expensive action is not alarmism, but arithmetic. Begin with heat, because it is the risk that most directly challenges the cultural assumptions about Britain's climate that are most deeply embedded in how the country builds, plans, and lives. The committee projects that, without action to help the population adapt, the increasing risk of heat waves in the 40 degrees Celsius range by mid-century could lead to as many as 10,000 excess deaths per year. 10,000 people every year. The 2022 heat wave, which briefly pushed temperatures above 40 degrees at Coningsby in Lincolnshire for the first and so far only time in the British record, caused an estimated 2,800 excess deaths across England in a single multi-week period. The committee is projecting that by 2050, without adaptation, the conditions that produce that mortality figure could become annual rather than exceptional. By 2050, the CCC states 92% of UK homes are likely to overheat under the projected climate conditions. Not some homes, not homes in the south of England, 92% of all UK homes. The physical reason for this figure is not complicated. British homes were built to retain heat. They have thick walls designed for insulation against cold. They have limited window area, often north or east facing, designed to admit winter light rather than manage summer solar gain. They have no mechanical cooling. In a pre-climate change Britain, where summer temperatures rarely exceeded 30 degrees for more than a few days, those design choices were entirely rational. In 2050, Britain, where heat waves in the low to mid-40s become a regular summer feature, those same design choices become lethal for the elderly, the very young, and the medically vulnerable who live in buildings that trap heat rather than managing it. The committee's specific recommendations on heat are more radical than any government has been willing to publicly commit to. Baroness Brown, speaking this morning about the report, said something that will stay with anyone who heard it. She told journalists that ministers should even consider changing the school year so that pupils are not forced to sit important national examinations during summer heat, when they may not have been able to sleep properly, and are, in her words, absolutely not at their best. This is the chair of the Climate Change Committee's Adaptation Subcommittee saying that the British examination calendar, embedded in the national culture as an immovable feature of the school year since the 19th century, needs to be reconsidered because the climate has made sitting those examinations in their current summer window a source of genuine educational disadvantage for children sleeping in houses that are too hot. The recommendation to install air conditioning in hospitals and care homes by 2035 and in schools by 2050 carries the same underlying message. These buildings were not designed for the climate they will be operating in. The choice is between retrofitting them or accepting the human cost of leaving them as they are. The workplace dimension of the heat risk is where the committee's recommendations directly intersect with an ongoing and bitter labor relations debate that has been building in Britain for years. There is currently no legal maximum temperature for UK workplaces. There is a minimum temperature requirement, 16 degrees Celsius for most work environments, but nothing on the other end of the scale. Workers in warehouses, factories, retail environments, and outdoor occupations have no legal protection if temperature inside their workplace reaches 35 or 40 degrees. Trade unions have been campaigning for a maximum workplace temperature law for years. The Climate Change Committee has now joined that call explicitly, stating that the government should commit to a national maximum temperature for workplaces to protect workers' safety and incentivize the deployment of cooling. This is a direct and consequential policy recommendation that the committee is framing not as a worker rights issue, but as a climate adaptation necessity. Because the frequency with which UK workplaces exceed any sensible maximum temperature threshold is going to increase dramatically as heat waves become more common and more intense. The productivity, safety, and health costs of unmanaged workplace heat are quantifiable and growing. Move to flooding, and the scale of what the committee is projecting becomes, if anything, even more alarming than the heat numbers. By 2050, peak river flows across the UK could be up to 45% higher than they are today, not in a single extreme event. As a new baseline, river systems that currently flood at a certain frequency and to a certain depth would, under conditions where peak flows are 45% higher, flood more. Often deeper and across a wider geographic area. The committee states that sea levels could rise by 20 to 45 centimeters by 2050, a range that spans a wide set of possible futures, but whose lower end already represents enough additional tidal water height to fundamentally change the flood RASK calculus for every coastal community in England and Wales. The cost of flooding, crop losses, excess deaths, productivity losses, and transport and health service disruption is currently running at up to £60 billion a year. Not projected, currently. Right now, the damage that Britain's existing and inadequate flood defense infrastructure fails to prevent is costing the economy up to £60 billion per year. The committee projects that, without adaptation investment, the figure could rise to as much as £260 billion per year by 2050. To put those numbers in context, the total annual budget of the NHS in England is approximately £180 billion. The projected cost of climate inaction on flooding and related impacts by 2050, £260 billion, exceeds the entire NHS budget. The committee's proposed solution is a dramatic increase in annual flood defence investment, rising to between £1.6 and £2.2 billion per year across the UK. That is an increase from current levels that sounds large in absolute terms but is dwarfed by the £60 billion per year the country is already losing to climate impacts that better defences would prevent. The return on investment arithmetic is not subtle. Every pound spent on flood defense today prevents multiple pounds of damage and economic loss within the investment window. The committee is not asking for money that the country cannot afford. It is pointing out that the country cannot afford to keep not spending it. The recommendation that new homes should not be built in flood-prone areas carries an implication that the planning system has been systematically ignoring for decades. Between 2011 and 2021, more than 100,000 new homes were built in areas classified as being at significant flood risk in England. This in a country where the Environment Agency regularly publishes flood risk maps that clearly identify those areas. The incentive structures of the planning system, the political pressure to build more homes, and the economic reality that flood risk land is cheaper than flood-safe land have combined to create a situation in which the country has continued adding properties to its flood risk register at scale even as the underlying flood risk itself has been rising. The committee is calling for an end to that practice, explicitly calling for the government to avoid new construction, where risks are not adequately reduced, and to manage development in flood-prone areas carefully. This is not a new recommendation from climate advisors. It is a recommendation that has been made repeatedly over decades and repeatedly set aside by governments prioritizing housing delivery targets over long-term climate resilience. The drought dimension of the committee's report is perhaps the least publicly Understood of the three primary risk categories, and the framing that Baroness Brown used to describe it in her media comments this morning was designed to make it viscerally comprehensible. She said, "We are facing a potential world where, in 2050, you could turn the tap on and nothing would come out. Water shortfalls of up to 5 billion liters per day by 2050. That figure needs context to land properly. The total daily water consumption of all households in England is approximately 14 billion liters per day. A shortfall of 5 billion liters represents more than a third of current total household consumption. The physical drivers of this projected shortfall are a combination of reduced rainfall during the growing season, as the jet stream displacement that produces British summer heat events also reduces the Atlantic rainfall that recharges groundwater and reservoir systems, and increased demand from a growing population alongside the elevated evaporation and irrigation needs created by higher temperatures. The committee's call for the government to scale up sustainable water storage, accelerate leakage reduction, and cut demand are all sensible and achievable policy directions. But the gap between those policy ambitions and the infrastructure investment that would actually deliver them is enormous. England's water system leaks approximately 3 billion liters per day, roughly 1/5 of all water put into supply. That leakage rate has remained stubbornly high for decades because water utility investment in leak reduction has consistently been insufficient to overcome the aging pipe infrastructure problem. The climate is now providing a date by which that infrastructure failure must be resolved because the system cannot absorb a 5 billion liter daily shortfall on top of 3 billion liters lost to leakage every day. The report's recommendation that the committee target ensuring water supplies are resilient to a 1 in 500 year drought by 2040 sets a specific and demanding benchmark that forces the water industry and the government to confront the infrastructure investment question directly rather than managing it through successive 5-year regulatory cycles. The CCC's total estimated investment requirement, £11 billion per year in combined public and private spending through to 2050, covers the full range of adaptation measures across heat, flooding, drought, infrastructure, resilience, nature, and farming. £11 billion per year is a substantial number. £60 billion per year in current damage costs, rising to $260 billion by 2050 without action, is the alternative. The committee is presenting this as a choice, but it is not a difficult choice arithmetically. The difficulty is political, mustering the sustained commitment to multi-decade investment programs across election cycles, departmental boundaries, and competing spending pressures. The infrastructure resilience section of the report addresses something that rarely receives the public attention its importance deserves. The UK's critical infrastructure, its energy grid, its rail network, its telecommunication systems, its road network, its water and sewage infrastructure, was designed as a set of separate, independently functioning systems. Each one was engineered to a set of performance specifications calibrated for the climate conditions prevailing at the time of construction. The problem the committee identifies is not just that each individual system is now operating outside its design climate envelope. It is that the dependencies between systems, the way failures in one cascade into failures in others, create a vulnerability multiplier that makes the total infrastructure risk significantly greater than the sum of its individual parts. When a heat wave buckles railway tracks, trains cannot run, which means workers cannot reach data centers, which affects telecommunications, which affects emergency service coordination, which affects the ability of health services to respond to the heat-related medical emergencies the same heat wave is generating simultaneously. The committee is calling for a more structured approach to managing these interdependencies, for the first time formally recommending that government and regulators treat infrastructure resilience as a whole system problem rather than a collection of sector-specific problems. The farming section of the report connects the climate adaptation challenge to the most fundamental question of national security, whether Britain can continue to feed itself as the climate shifts the geographic and seasonal distribution of viable agricultural production, crop diversification away from the varieties that current British farming is organized around, winter wheat, oilseed rape, sugar beet, the commodity crops of a temperate maritime climate, toward crops suited to conditions that will be progressively warmer and drier in summer is not a future. Adaptation. It is a current necessity for farmers who are already seeing their yields stressed in ways that the crop varieties and agronomic practices they inherited are not equipped to manage. The committee calls for the government to support farmers with the skills, information, and training they need to make climate-resilient decisions, and to improve the quality and availability of information on climate risks across the food system. The mention of considering the potential for large-scale national food stockpiling is a striking inclusion, one that signals the committee's assessment that the risk of climate-driven food supply disruption has reached a level where emergency preparedness planning is a legitimate government responsibility rather than a contingency too alarming to discuss publicly. Insurance is the final dimension of the report's recommendations that carries immediate and direct implications for millions of British households. The committee calls for ensuring the right protections are in place and the costs of extreme weather are shared so that insurance remains affordable and available. That framing addresses a crisis that is already quietly unfolding in the UK's coastal and flood risk property market. Insurance premiums for flood risk properties have been rising significantly for several years. Some areas have become effectively uninsurable through the private market, relying on the Flood Government Reinsurance Scheme, which was always designed as a transitional mechanism, not a permanent solution, to maintain access to affordable cover. As flood risk increases and more properties fall outside the risk tolerance of standard insurance underwriting, the population of households that cannot obtain affordable home insurance will grow. The social consequences of that growth, the concentration of uninsured housing risk in lower income communities less able to self-insure, the impact on property values in flood risk areas, the erosion of the wealth security that home ownership is supposed to represent, are precisely the kind of long-term, diffuse harms that do not produce a single visible crisis, but quietly undermine the financial security of millions of households over years. The timing of this report, published today, May 20th, 2026, lands in a moment of extraordinary atmospheric irony. Today is also the day that the UK is experiencing the warmth returning after the most violently contradictory May in living memory. The Arctic blast that brought snow to Dartmoor and Norfolk a week ago has retreated. Temperatures are climbing toward the mid-20s across southern England. Half-term is approaching with the promise of warmth. And the Climate Change Committee is publishing a report that says, in terms that permit no ambiguity, that the pleasant days of a warming Britain come packaged with consequences that the country has not prepared for, has not built for, and is currently choosing to absorb as damage costs rather than address as adaptation investment. The report's message of hope, that solutions exist, that the technologies are proven, that with the right decisions and actions, Britain can protect the people and places it loves, is genuine and grounded in real evidence. But so is its message of urgency. Successive governments have not done enough. The gap between the climate that exists and the infrastructure designed for a climate that no longer exists is growing, and the arithmetic of £11 billion a year to adapt versus £260 billion a year in damages is not the arithmetic of a choice that can be deferred indefinitely without consequence. It is the arithmetic of a country that has already been told, and is being told again in the most authoritative terms available, that the time to act is not approaching. It has arrived.